So when it comes to developing for WebGL, you essentially have two options. You can program WebGL at the low level. And again, this is similar, or it's almost identical actually, to OpenGL programming. Now, myself and most other Flash developers don't have that low-level knowledge. And the reality is you don't need to have it because there are high-level frameworks out there that take all the hard work out of doing WebGL development. And that's what I'm going to show you how to do in this movie using a library called Three.js. So if you go to github.com/mrdoob/3.js, and you may notice if you've done Flash development for a while, Mr. Doob was actually a really big Flash guy who actually worked on Papervision and some other 3D frameworks. And he's now moved over to doing HTML development. And this is just a great library to allow you to easily do 3D stuff with WebGL. So from this GitHub page, you can either go through and clone or check it out from GitHub if you want to do all that stuff, or you can just come down the page and get the minified version of Three.js, which is the compressed version. It's just a single JavaScript file. So I'm going to click on that, and here is what the file looks like. Now, obviously, you're not going to want to really browse through this one, but we're just essentially going to save this now. So I'm just going to hit Command or Control S. And I'm going to save this to the desktop where my HTML document is. Okay, so I'm going to go over to Sublime Text. Now, obviously, the first thing I have to do in my document here is import the Three.js file. So I'm going to put in a new script tag, put in a source attribute, Three.js. So if you've worked with any of the ActionScript-based 3D frameworks in the past, it's a very similar workflow as a lot of those other frameworks. So what I'm going to do here is above my init function, I need to define a bunch of variables. I'm going to define them as global variables here. So var, and the first thing I need to create is a camera variable, a scene variable, and this is going to hold my 3D scene. A 3D scene needs to have a renderer. So I'm going to define that variable. Now I'm going to be creating a single cube, and I'm going to hold that in a variable called cube. We're going to have a material for that cube. So I'm going to create a variable called material. And lastly, we need to create a mesh object out of both the cube geometry and that material. So I'll have a variable called mesh here. So in my init function, again, which happens once my page is loaded, I can go ahead and start setting up my 3D scene. So I'm going to say scene is equal to new 3.scene. So the 3 object, all uppercase, is the object that we actually deal with. And this is actually supposed to be a capital S. So I'm creating a new 3D scene there. Now, obviously, a 3D scene has to have a camera. So I'm going to define that camera. So camera is equal to new 3. Now, there's multiple cameras that you can use, but I'm going to use a perspective camera. So new perspective camera. And there are multiple properties that I need to send to this constructor. So what we can do is go back into the browser, and we can look at the online documentation if you need to know what the actual values are here. So if we look under cameras, we have a perspective camera, and it actually tells me the parameters. So we have field of view, the aspect ratio, the near clipping plane, and the far clipping plane. So if we go back to our code now, I'm going to put in those values. So I'm going to put in 75. Now for the aspect ratio, we want to take the width of our browser window and divide it by the height of the browser window. So I can get that by window.inner width, and I'm going to divide that by window.inner height. So now for the other properties, I'm going to put in 1 for the near clipping plane, and then let's do 10,000 for the far clipping plane. So now we've set up our camera object. Now we actually need to position the camera in 3D space. So I'm going to say camera.position.z is equal to 1,000. Now we've created the camera. Now we actually need to add this camera to our 3D scene. To do that, we say scene.add camera. So we now have our scene set up. We now have our camera. Now we actually need to work on having an object in the scene that we can see. So we're going to use that cube variable. I'm going to say cube is equal to new 3.cubeGeometry. Now, if you look in the documentation, you'll see there's a whole host of different geometries available. You can make, let's say, a plane, you can make a torus, you can make all types of different things that you can do there. So for a cube geometry, I need to pass in 3 values. This is obviously the width, the height, and the depth of the cube. So I'm going to put in 300 for all of those. So I have this cube now. Now I need to apply a material to the cube so you can actually see it in the scene. So I'm going to use that material variable, and this variable is going to be a new 3.mesh basic material. And again, look in the documentation for other materials, and in the next movie I'll show you how to use a couple of the other materials. Now to this I need to pass in an object, and the first property I'm going to set is the color of the material. We'll make it a blue color. Now there's another property I can set which basically says, do I want to render this in wireframe mode? If I just want to see the wireframe of the object, and I'll do that. So I'll set the wireframe property equal to true. So now I've created my geometry, I've created my material. Now we need to actually combine those together into a mesh, which is actually what I'll add to my scene. So I'm going to use that mesh variable. So mesh is equal to new 3.mesh. And I need to pass in both the geometry and the material. So that's cube and then material. So this mesh now is the object that I actually add to my 3D scene. So I say scene.add mesh. Okay, so now my scene is set up the way I want, but now to actually visually see this, I need to render the scene. And for that, I need to set up my renderer. So I'm going to use that renderer property that I created and set it equal to new 3.canvas renderer. Now the first thing I need to do to the renderer is to set the size. So how large do I actually want to render this into the browser window? Well, I'm going to have it fill the browser window. So I'm going to say renderer.setSize. And again, I'll use these 2 properties up here, the inner width of the window and the inner height. So it's essentially going to make this thing span my entire browser window. Now this renderer is the actual DOM element that I need to add to my HTML DOM so that I can see it. So we're going to do that here in JavaScript. So for this example, we're not doing anything down in the body tag. We're actually going to append this to the DOM using JavaScript. And to do that, I say document.body.append_child. Now we're going to add the renderer.dom element. So now we have our completed code. The thing we're going to do is we're actually going to animate this cube around. So to do that, we need an animation loop. And like I showed you in earlier tutorials, we're going to use the request animation frame API. Now what's nice about Three.js is it includes that request animation frame shim code that I showed you how to use earlier. So what I'm going to do here is to call a function called animate, which is going to start the animation happening. So let's go ahead and define that now. So function animate. And remember, the first thing I do is to call that request animation frame function and pass in animate. And that's going to have this function be called repetitively. All I want to do is to take this mesh and rotate it on both the X and the Y axis a little bit on every frame. So mesh.rotation.x plus equals 0.02. And I'm going to copy that and do the same thing for the Y rotation. Now this alone is not going to allow me to see those changes. We actually need to render the 3D scene. So to do that, I need to say renderer.render and then give the 3D scene and the camera that I want to render. Because remember, we can have multiple cameras in our 3D scene. So I'm going to say scene and camera. Okay, so let's go over to the browser and see if we have this working. So I'll refresh. And now you can see we have our 3D cube that on every frame is actually rotating a little bit on the y-axis and on the x-axis. Now if we go back to the code and let's remove that wireframe property, and you'll see what it looks like. If we come back and refresh, we essentially have something where it's just a solid blue color. Now you can kind of see that it's a cube here because you can kind of see the edges. But in the next movie, we're going to look at how we can add different shaders and actually lights to our scene so we can make it look like more of a proper 3D environment.